Imagine standing in a quiet English manor house in the countryside. The year is 1940, and the air smells faintly of damp paper, cigarette smoke, and ink. You can hear the faint mechanical chatter of typewriters from another room, the low hum of secret machines, and the whispered urgency of men and women who know that every minute, every single letter could change the outcome of the war. Somewhere in that maze of rooms, a shy, brilliant mathematician with an awkward gait and a stammer is staring at a blackboard covered in strange symbols. His name is Alan Turing, and what he's about to do will not just win the war, it will shape the entire future of humanity. But back then, he wasn't thinking about changing the world. He was thinking about one thing: how to outsmart a machine built by the Nazis, the Enigma. Before we get deep into the story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you love stories like this real human tales behind history's biggest moments. Hit the like button. Share this with a friend who enjoys untold war stories. And let's dive into one of the most fascinating chapters of World War II, the codebreakers of Bletchley Park, and how they broke Hitler's supposedly unbreakable code. Now, to truly understand the genius of what Turing and his team achieved, we first have to understand what they were up against. The German Enigma machine wasn't just a cipher, it was an engineering marvel. Disguised as a typewriter, each key press sent an electrical current through a maze of rotating rotors that substituted one letter for another in a way that changed every single time you pressed a key. One letter typed could equal another letter today, and something completely different a second later. The number of possible combinations was astronomical, somewhere around 150 quintillion. That's a number so large it's practically meaningless to the human mind. The Germans believed Enigma was unbreakable, even if you had an Enigma machine. Without the correct daily key settings, rotor order, ring settings, plug board swaps, you could type for 1,000 years and never stumble on the right one. Early in the war, the British knew that breaking Enigma was essential. Every German military message, whether it was about submarine positions in the Atlantic or troop movements in North Africa, was hidden inside that electric riddle. The stakes couldn't be higher. And yet, the first major crack in the Enigma wall didn't come from Britain at all. It came from Poland. In the early 1930s, before war even broke out, a small group of Polish mathematicians led by Marian Rejewski had begun studying intercepted German messages. They were brilliant, quiet men working in secret at the Polish Cipher Bureau. Using mathematical analysis, Rejewski deduced the internal wiring of the Enigma machine, an achievement many later called nothing short of miraculous. The Poles even built their own mechanical devices, called bombos, to help find Enigma settings faster. But when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Polish cryptologists knew they couldn't hold onto their discovery. In a quiet forest near Warsaw, they met with French and British intelligence officers and shared everything they knew. That single act of cooperation gave Britain a fighting chance. Fast forward to September 1939. War has erupted across Europe, and Britain needs a place to coordinate intelligence. They choose Bletchley Park, a sprawling Victorian estate north of London. It doesn't look like the nerve center of the Allied code-breaking effort. It looks like a sleepy country manor, but inside those brick walls, A revolution in intelligence is about to begin. Bletchley quickly filled with an unlikely army of minds linguists, crossword champions, mathematicians, chess players, and even debutantes who'd been quietly trained in cryptography. They were bound together by secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they were doing. They couldn't even discuss it between departments. Every piece of paper, every note, was classified. Among them was Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician who had already written a theoretical paper describing a universal machine that could perform any computation. He was strange, socially awkward, often lost in thought, but his mind was on another level. When others said Enigma was impossible to break, he didn't see impossibility. He saw a problem of logic waiting to be unraveled. The first time Turing saw an Enigma machine, he reportedly studied it silently, then muttered, "It's just a question of time." But time was exactly what they didn't have. Each day, at midnight, the Germans changed their Enigma settings, wiping out any progress made on the previous day's codes. That meant the British had 24 hours to solve an astronomical puzzle before the board reset. If they failed, hundreds of ships, soldiers, or pilots could die because of what they didn't know. Turing began working on a mechanical device inspired by the Polish bomber, but designed to be faster and more flexible. He called it the bomb. It wasn't a computer in the modern sense, but a complex network of rotating drums and electrical circuits designed to mimic the Enigma's workings. By feeding intercepted messages into the bomb and testing thousands of possible combinations per minute, Turing hoped to discover the correct daily settings. The first bomb was installed in 1940. It was a massive, noisy machine, wheels turning, relays clicking. The rhythmic pulse of logic turned mechanical. It looked like madness to most, but to Turing and his team, it was music. The moment that machine found its first correct Enigma key, the room reportedly erupted with cheers. For the first time, the Allies could read what the Germans were saying in real time. But the war didn't pause to let them celebrate. Every new breakthrough led to a new problem. The Germans soon added more rotors to the Enigma, creating new complexities. And then came the U-boat menace. German submarines, prowling the Atlantic, were sinking Allied convoys faster than they could be replaced. The Enigma used by the German Navy, known as the Shark version, was even more secure. Without cracking it, Britain risked starvation. Food, fuel, weapons, everything had to cross the ocean. And the U-boats were picking off supply ships daily. Churchill later said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Turing made it his mission to crack naval Enigma. He moved into his own hut at Bletchley Hut 8 and worked day and night, often fueled only by cups of weak tea and an occasional apple. His desk was buried in paper, cables, and strange notes written in code. He wore the same jacket for days, cycled to work in the rain with a gas mask strapped to his face, not because of air raids, but because he thought it protected him from pollen, and chained his coffee mug to the radiator so no one would steal it. To outsiders, he seemed eccentric. To those who knew him, he was irreplaceable. The turning point came when Turing realized that human error, the smallest slit in German radio procedure, could be their key. Sometimes, Operators used predictable phrases like Heil Hitler or sent identical messages twice with minor changes. These patterns, known as cribs, gave the bomb something to latch onto. One day, when a careless German officer repeated part of a weather report, Turing and his team used that to deduce the day's settings. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Allied intelligence, now reading naval Enigma, could track U-boats across the Atlantic. Convoys were rerouted, submarines ambushed, and by 1943, the tide had turned at its peak. Bletchley Park employed nearly 10,000 people. The work was relentless, the secrecy absolute. They worked in wooden huts, often freezing in winter, with blackout curtains drawn tight. And yet, within those walls, friendships formed, romances sparked, and rivalries grew. One of Turing's closest collaborators, Gordon Welchman, introduced an innovation called the diagonal board, which made the bombs even faster. Together, they formed a bond of respect built not on words, but on shared obsession. And then there was Joan Clark, a brilliant young cryptanalyst who worked under Turing in Hut 8. She was quiet, methodical, and one of the few women in the room treated as an equal. The two became close, often walking the grounds together discussing puzzles. At one point, Turing even proposed to her, but later, he confessed he couldn't go through with it because he was homosexual, a truth that in those days could destroy a man's career, or worse. Joan accepted it with grace, and their friendship endured, built on mutual admiration. As 1942 turned into 1943, the Allies were reading Enigma messages so quickly that intelligence officers had to create a new term for it. Ultra. Every intercepted message decrypted at Bletchley was stamped Top Secret Ultra, meaning its contents were so sensitive only a handful of senior commanders could see them. Churchill himself called the Bletchley codebreakers his geese that laid the golden eggs, but never cackled. Pause here for a second. If you're enjoying this journey into the hidden world of WWII code breaking, don't forget to subscribe right now. It really helps this channel grow, so we can keep telling these forgotten stories. Drop a comment about which part of Turing's life fascinates you most, and share this with someone who loves true stories of genius and courage. When the first Ultra decrypts started to arrive at Allied command centers, it was like having a window into the enemy's soul. Suddenly, the fog of war lifted just enough for commanders to make sense of chaos. Every night, couriers rushed from Bletchley Park to London with sealed envelopes marked most secret. Inside were translations of German military communications, orders from High Command, naval movements, Luftwaffe operations. The information couldn't simply be used openly, it had to be disguised, filtered through other intelligence sources so the Germans would never suspect. Their codes had been broken. That delicate dance between knowing too much and revealing too little became an art form. And all the while, Alan Turing's machines kept spinning, searching, finding, unlocking. By 1943, Bletchley was running dozens of bombs around the clock. The noise was deafening, the hum of electric motors, the click-clack rhythm of rotors turning, operators calling out settings, engineers dashing between machines to restart one that had overheated. The air smelled of oil and ozone, and the tension was electric. When a bomb stopped when it hit a match, there was a brief silence, then cheers. Somewhere, another message had fallen open. Another secret had been stolen from Hitler's war machine. Still, the pressure on Turing and his colleagues was immense. They weren't soldiers dodging bullets, but they were fighting a different kind of battle, one of logic, patience, and time. Every delay meant more lives lost at sea. The guilt was heavy. There are accounts of codebreakers working 18-hour shifts, sleeping under their desks, their eyes red from exhaustion. And yet, there was pride too. A quiet pride that came from knowing their minds were their weapons. One of the most dramatic examples of Ultra's impact came in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats had been terrorizing convoys, sinking merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Britain was dangerously close to running out of food and fuel. The Admiralty needed to know where those submarines were hiding, and thanks to Bletchley, they began to. By reading Enigma traffic between U-boat commanders and headquarters, the Allies could route convoys around danger zones. They even began ambushing the hunters. Slowly, the tables turned. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, an enormous blow to Germany's naval campaign. That victory, more than most, was born in the silent huts of Bletchley Park. Turing himself wasn't one for celebration. He was shy about praise and indifferent to status. While others toasted the success of their machines, he'd retreat to his desk, already thinking of the next improvement. His mind never seemed to stop. Colleagues described him as brilliant, but utterly unpredictable. He'd sometimes disappear mid-conversation to go running across the fields, or arrive late to meetings with his tie crooked and hair uncombed, muttering about mathematical proofs. But when the conversation turned to Enigma or computation, his focus was absolute. He had a strange relationship with authority. He didn't care much for ranks or titles and often clashed with senior officers who didn't understand the technical side of his work. Once, when asked to write a report summarizing his progress, Turing reportedly sighed and said, "They want me to explain thinking." That was the heart of it. He was doing something so new, so abstract, that even his superiors couldn't fully grasp it. Despite the secrecy, word began to spread through the British intelligence community that something extraordinary was happening at Bletchley. Generals who used to scoff at mathematicians now depended on their results. And the relationship between code breaking and the battlefield grew tighter. When the Allies prepared for the invasion of North Africa, Enigma decrypts revealed that the Germans were expecting an attack in Greece. That single piece of misinformation fed to them deliberately through controlled leaks kept entire divisions in the wrong place when the Allies struck. The success of Operation Torch in 1940 owed much to Bletchley's silent work. But it wasn't always so clear-cut. The morality of code-breaking was a heavy burden. Sometimes, they intercepted messages about planned bombings or attacks, but couldn't act without exposing the secret. There are stories haunting ones of code-breakers who knew that certain ships were about to be attacked, yet had to stay silent to protect Ultra. Some couldn't sleep at night, wrestling with the knowledge that saving one mission might cost another. Turing understood that burden deeply. For all his logical brilliance, he was a man of quiet empathy. He once said, We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done. Around this time, the Americans joined the effort in earnest. The US Navy set up its own code-breaking operations, and the two nations began collaborating on a scale never seen before. Machines, ciphers, intelligence all shared across the Atlantic under the cloak of total secrecy. Bletchley even helped the Americans build their own bombs, faster and more advanced, to handle the ever-growing flood of encrypted traffic. It became an industrial-scale war of brains. And then came the next great challenge, the Lorentz cipher. Unlike Enigma, which was used for field communications, Lorentz was reserved for the highest-level German messages, Hitler's direct communications with his generals. It was a far more complex machine, and when the British first intercepted Lorentz traffic in 1941, it seemed impossible to read. But the codebreakers, led by a man named Bill Toot, eventually figured out its structure purely through logic without ever seeing the machine itself. It was like solving a 12-rotor Enigma blindfolded. The solution required not just human brilliance, but something new entirely, a machine that could handle calculations faster than any person could manage. That's where the next chapter of history began. To process Lorentz traffic, engineer Tommy Flowers designed an electronic machine called Colossus, the world's first programmable digital computer. It filled an entire room with glowing valves and humming wires, and it could analyze encrypted text at a speed no human could match. When it came online in 1944, it transformed code-breaking forever. Turing didn't build Colossus himself, but his earlier ideas, the concept of a universal machine, were its spiritual foundation. He had imagined, years before, that a machine could simulate thought. Now, in wartime secrecy, that dream was taking form. By the time D-Day approached in June 1944, the full power of Bletchley's work came into play. Enigma decrypts revealed the strength and positioning of German divisions in France. The Allies knew which units were in Normandy, which were reserves, which were mobile, and which were immobilized. They knew, even, that Hitler's high command believed the invasion would come at Calais. Eisenhower's staff used ultra-intelligence to fine-tune the deception plan Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the main assault would land far from Normandy. That deception saved countless Allied lives and helped ensure the success of the landings. When the first waves of soldiers hit the beaches on June 6, 1944, they had no idea that a quiet man in a dimly lit hut, hundreds of miles away, had played a role in giving them a fighting chance. Bletchley's codebreakers never saw the front lines, but their fingerprints were on every major victory of the final years of the war. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Bletchley Park fell silent. Orders came down to destroy everything: machines, notes, wiring, even blueprints. The bombs were dismantled, their parts scrapped. The staff were sworn to lifelong secrecy. Most never spoke a word about what they'd done, not even to their spouses. Alan Turing went back to his research, moving to Manchester to work on computing machines in peace. To the public, he was just another academic. His greatest wartime achievements remained locked away under the Official Secrets Act. And yet, for all his genius, his post-war life was marked by tragedy. Turing's homosexuality, criminalized in Britain at the time, led to his persecution. In 1952, after reporting a burglary at his home, he admitted to the police that he was gay. Instead of protecting him, the law turned against him. He was charged with gross indecency and faced imprisonment. To avoid jail, he accepted chemical castration, a cruel, humiliating punishment that altered his body and health. He continued to work, but his spirit dimmed. In 1954, he was found dead in his home, an apple by his bedside laced with cyanide. He was just 41. Some believe it was suicide. Others say it might have been an accident. But whatever the cause, the world had lost one of its brightest minds. It took decades for his story to be told, and even longer for his name to be cleared. In 2009, the British government finally issued an apology, and in 2013, he received a royal pardon. Today, his face appears on the £50 note, and his name stands at the foundation of computer science, cryptography, and artificial intelligence. But what's truly remarkable is how quietly he lived that greatness. Alan Turing never sought fame. He wasn't a warrior, or a politician, or a general. He was just a man who loved puzzles, who believed that problems had solutions, and who dared to imagine a machine that could think. His story isn't just about breaking codes, it's about seeing patterns where others see chaos, about believing in logic even when the world feels illogical. And if you think about it, that belief changed everything. The computer or phone you're watching this on, the code that runs the world today, it all traces back to the mind of a man who, 80 years ago, was sitting in a cold hut at Bletchley Park, staring at a riddle wrapped in wires. If you're still here, you're the kind of person who loves digging into the human side of history, the minds behind the moments. So don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who's ever wondered how one quiet mathematician helped save millions. After the war, the silence around Bletchley Park felt almost eerie. Thousands of people who'd worked there just disappeared back into ordinary life. Clerks, engineers, mathematicians, translators, all sworn to secrecy. No one could talk about what they'd done, not to their families, not even to each other outside the gates. Imagine that, spending 6 years doing work that changed the course of history, only to walk away as if it never happened. Some went back to teaching. Others joined government offices or private firms. A few stayed in intelligence, still working behind layers of secrecy. But for most, the memories faded into the quiet corners of their minds. Turing returned to academia, first to the National Physical Laboratory and later to Manchester University, where he continued his pursuit of something even more ambitious than code breaking. The war had proved one thing beyond any doubt: machines could do the work of men, if guided by the right kind of thought. Turing had spent years designing systems to mimic logic, to make mechanical devices think their way through problems. Now, in peacetime, he wanted to push that idea as far as it could go. He began working on what he called the Automatic Computing Engine, ACE for short. It was a machine meant not just to perform calculations, but to remember, to adapt, to follow stored instructions. This was the seed of what we now call the stored program computer. You could write code that told the machine how to behave. For Turing, this wasn't just engineering, it was philosophy. He believed the mind itself could be described as a kind of machine, one that followed rules, processed information, and learned through experience. He didn't see intelligence as a mystical property, but as something that could, in theory, be replicated. That idea made people uneasy back then. The notion that a machine might think felt almost blasphemous. Even some of Turing's peers dismissed it as science fiction. But he wasn't fazed. He once wrote, "The idea behind digital computers may be explained by saying that these machines are intended to carry out any operations which could be done by a human computer." He'd seen the power of logic to save lives. Now he was trying to give that logic a mind of its own. What's fascinating is that the groundwork he laid at Bletchley Park directly influenced his post-war designs. The Bonds and Colossus machines had shown him what was possible when mechanical systems worked in parallel, testing thousands of combinations at once. He realized that real intelligence, whether biological or artificial, relied on that same principle. Complexity built from simplicity, small parts, each doing something basic, combining into something astonishing. But Turing wasn't just a visionary theorist. He was also intensely practical. He wanted to build things. When bureaucracy at the National Physical Laboratory stalled his plans for the ACE, he moved north to Manchester, where the first modern computer, the Manchester Baby, was coming to life. It could store data in electronic memory and execute programs automatically, a dream that had existed only in Turing's papers just a few years before. At Manchester, he took on new challenges. He wrote programs for the early computers and began to explore what we'd now call artificial intelligence. He even proposed what became the famous Turing test, a way to measure a machine's intelligence not by its internal workings, but by its behavior. If a machine could hold a conversation indistinguishable from a human's, then, he argued, it should be considered intelligent. It was a radical thought in 1950, and it still sparks debate today. What made Turing remarkable wasn't just his intellect, it was his courage to think differently. In a world still recovering from war, still bound by convention, he asked questions that no one else dared. Could machines think? Could consciousness be understood? Could logic itself become alive? And underneath all of that was something deeply human, the desire to understand how the mind works and why it matters. But even as he shaped the future, the shadows of the past caught up with him. Britain in the early 1950s was still rigid, conservative, fearful of anything that broke the mold. The same country that had quietly relied on his brilliance to win the war now turned against him. Because of who he was, the cruelty of it still stings. Here was a man who had saved lives by the thousands, yet his own life was reduced to a scandal in the eyes of the law still. Even through humiliation and decline, Turing's mind kept moving. He began studying biology of all things, trying to explain how patterns in nature, like the stripes on a zebra or the spirals of a sunflower, might arise from simple mathematical rules. He called it morphogenesis. It was an attempt to bridge the gap between the mechanical and the organic, between logic and life. To him, it was all connected. The same principles that governed machines might also govern the growth of living things. The universe, he believed, was one great code waiting to be understood. I once met an old engineer who'd known Turing briefly in Manchester. He said that being around him felt like standing next to an electrical storm. You could feel the energy, he told me, but there was a sadness too, as if he knew he was running out of time. That stayed with me, because when you read his papers or look at his notes, you see flashes of brilliance that were years, decades ahead of their time. Neural networks, machine learning, pattern formation, it's all there. In rough sketches and careful logic. He was imagining the 21st century before it had even begun. And maybe that's why his story matters so much today. We live in the world he dreamed of, one built on algorithms and machines that think. The smartphones in our hands, the satellites in orbit, the AI systems that drive cars and diagnose diseases, they all descend from the principles he laid down. He cracked Enigma, yes, but in doing so, he also cracked open a door to the future. When you think about it, that's what history is really about. Not just the battles or the treaties, but the moments when one mind changes the trajectory of the world. Alan Turing was one of those minds. The tragedy is that he never lived to see how far his ideas would go. The triumph is that they outlived him, you know. People sometimes ask if he ever realized how much he'd achieved, even before the honors and memorials came. I like to think he did. In his own quiet way, he must have known that he'd done something extraordinary. He once wrote, "We may hope that machines will eventually compete with men in all purely intellectual fields." There's a certain gentle pride in those words, a hint of satisfaction that he'd started something that couldn't be undone. It's tempting to imagine what he might have thought of the modern world, the internet, by the way data moves across continents in seconds. I think he would have been both amazed and amused. He would have smiled at our smartphones and said, "Yes, I suppose I saw that coming." Still, beyond the science and the machines, there's something deeper about Turing's legacy. His story is a reminder that genius doesn't always wear the face we expect. He was awkward, eccentric, sometimes difficult, often misunderstood. He didn't fit neatly into society's expectations, and that made him vulnerable. But it also made him free to think in ways others couldn't. There's a strange kind of courage in that, being yourself when the world doesn't want you to be. The more you study Turing, the more you realize that his life mirrors the very code he broke. Enigma was a machine built on secrets, complexity, and layers of meaning. Turing was, in his own way, the same. Beneath the logic and equations, there was a man who longed for connection, for understanding, for a world that accepted difference instead of punishing it. And maybe that's why his work feels so human, even when it's about machines. He wasn't just teaching circuits to think. He was teaching us to see intelligence and compassion in new forms. Before we move on, if you're finding yourself drawn to this kind of storytelling, the people behind the brilliance, the courage behind the silence, then take a second to subscribe. Drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and pass this along to someone who loves stories where history meets humanity. These tales aren't just about the past, they're about us now. As we approach the end of Turing's story, It's worth stepping back for a moment to see the full picture. The war had ended years before, but its echoes still shaped everything. The Cold War was beginning, technology was racing ahead, and nations were competing to control the future. Somewhere in that transition, the work that began at Bletchley Park evolved into the digital revolution. The first computers were built not for curiosity, but for survival, for calculating missile trajectories, decoding signals, managing vast systems of defense. Turing's vision had given the world a new weapon: information. And with that, the age of code had truly begun. The war raged on, but something remarkable began to unfold at Bletchley Park. Turing's machine, the bomb, had gone from a prototype humming in isolation to an entire fleet of mechanical giants, scattered across secret huts. Each bomb attacked a different version of Enigma, some tuned for the Luftwaffe, others for the Navy. And every morning, thousands of intercepted messages from across the front poured in cryptic lines of letters that looked meaningless. Yet hidden inside them were the positions of German U-boats, the coordinates of Luftwaffe raids, the plans for convoys and offensives. The race wasn't just about intellect anymore. It was about survival. The Allies were bleeding ships in the Atlantic. U-boats prowled like wolves, and convoys carrying food, weapons, and fuel were being ripped apart. The British were on the brink of starvation. If Turing and his team couldn't break the naval Enigma in time, Britain might literally run out of the means to fight. It was that simple. But the naval Enigma was far more complex. The Kriegsmarine used a fourth rotor and extra layer of encryption that made every possible combination leap into astronomical territory. Early bombs were useless against it. For weeks, Bletchley was flooded with intercepted naval traffic they couldn't read. Imagine the frustration. All those messages, all those signals, and they meant nothing but noise. Turing began obsessing over it. He hardly slept, barely ate, pacing around with his pipe in hand, muttering equations under his breath. Some described him like a ghost wandering through the huts at night, lost in thought. Others remembered his quiet moments in front of the machines, his hand on the switch, eyes closed, as if he could feel the pattern behind the noise. He was searching for order in chaos, for logic in madness. Then came a spark. One day in 1941, a German weather report arrived. Those reports were sent daily by the U-boats, always in the same format, often containing the same phrase: Wetterverhältnisse, weather forecast. The Germans had grown complacent, assuming no one could read them. But that single word gave Turing's team what they called a crib, a probable piece of plain text. They could line up with the cipher text. It was like finding a single thread in a knot, something to pull. They fed it into the bomb and watched as the machine came to life, spinning faster and faster, clacking like a mechanical heartbeat. Hours passed. The tension was unbearable. Then the bomb stopped. The indicators aligned. A setting appeared rotor positions that finally made sense. They'd done it. The naval Enigma had been cracked. Suddenly, the dark Atlantic was no longer blind. The Allies could read U-boat communications almost as they happened. Convoys were rerouted. Ambushes were avoided. The hunters became the hunted. In a matter of weeks, the tide began to turn. The number of lost ships dropped. The Germans never realized how much their secret world had been exposed. To them, it must have seemed like luck, like the British had developed some supernatural sixth sense. But it wasn't luck, it was logic, human persistence, and the mind of Alan Turing. And yet, even as these breakthroughs changed the course of the war, life inside Bletchley Park remained grueling. The workers operated under total secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they did. Many never spoke about it until decades later. Imagine the burden knowing that your work might save thousands of lives every day, but you could never say a word. There were friendships and rivalries, laughter and heartbreak, all hidden behind the fences. Some fell in love there, others broke down from exhaustion. And Turing, always the eccentric genius, continued to push beyond the limits of what machines could do. He didn't see the bomb as just a war tool, it was a step towards something bigger. He began sketching ideas for a universal machine, one that could not only break codes but think in abstract terms, process symbols, and learn patterns. The foundation of modern computing was being laid right there, in those wooden huts filled with cigarette smoke and clattering gears. One story always stuck with me. It's about the day Turing biked from his lodging to Bletchley, a chain dangling from his bicycle. When asked why he didn't fix it, he said he'd calculated the exact number of pedal rotations before it fell off, and was sure he'd make it to work before that happened. It's funny, almost charming, but it also says everything about the man. Precision and confidence mixed with a touch of madness. That's what made him special. And yet, for all his brilliance, Turing was a man fighting more than one battle. The war outside was brutal, yes, but there was another war quieter, crueler, waged within his own country. Alan Turing was a homosexual man living in a time when that simple fact was a crime in Britain. He kept it private, of course, but secrets like that always carried a cost. He could decipher the most complex ciphers in the world, but could never decode the human heart, or the prejudice that came with it. Still, he focused on the mission. Every message decrypted, every life saved, it gave him purpose. By 1943, the code-breaking operation had grown enormous. Over 9,000 people worked at Bletchley, from brilliant mathematicians to typists, engineers, and translators. Women made up a huge portion of the workforce, many of them unsung heroes. They operated bombs, analyzed signals, and caught patterns that even the machines missed. Figures like Joan Clark, a gifted mathematician and one of the few women in Turing's inner circle, made enormous contributions but received little recognition. Turing and Clark shared a deep bond built on intellect and respect. Even briefly becoming engaged, though, he later broke it off, explaining his truth with painful honesty. She accepted it. Their friendship endured. Meanwhile, Turing's work reached across the Atlantic. The Americans had entered the war, and soon British and American codebreakers began sharing intelligence. The US Navy, inspired by the British bomb, built an even faster version nicknamed Agnes by the operators. The collaboration between the two nations marked a new era of cryptanalysis. It wasn't just about breaking messages anymore. It was about understanding the enemy's psychology, predicting their behavior, and using information as a weapon more powerful than bombs. But there's something almost tragic about genius. When Turing solved the Enigma, he didn't celebrate. He simply moved on to the next challenge, the Lorentz cipher, a far more complex machine used for Hitler's high command. Most people would have rested after saving countless lives. Not Turing. He just looked at the chaos ahead and thought, what next? That relentless curiosity, that inability to stop thinking, was both his gift and his burden. The Lorentz cipher, used for top-level Nazi communications, was an entirely different beast. Instead of rotors, it used teleprinters and electrical circuits that produced thousands of combinations. It was practically unbreakable, yet, through a mix of luck and brilliance, another Bletchley mind-build troupe managed to deduce its structure without ever seeing the machine itself. Imagine reverse engineering something from thin air. That's what they did. They called their new code-breaking computer Colossus, built by engineer Tommy Flowers. It became the world's first programmable electronic computer. Vacuum tubes glowed like fireflies as it processed streams of data, running calculations no human could do in a lifetime. The irony is breathtaking, isn't it? While the world was tearing itself apart, the foundation of modern computing, the same machines that would one day power everything, from smartphones to space exploration, was being born in secret, out of desperation. And Turing's fingerprints were all over it. Around this time, something else shifted. Intelligence from Enigma decrypts known under the codename ULTRA was now feeding directly into Allied strategy. Commanders in North Africa, Italy, and later Normandy made moves based on information that only a handful of people knew existed. Ultra became the hidden hand guiding the war. Winston Churchill once said, "It was thanks to Ultra that we won." Historians still debate the exact numbers, but many believe Turing's work shortened the war by at least 2 years and saved over 14 million lives. 14 million. Just think about that. And yet, after the war, when the celebrations erupted and the medals were handed out, there was no parade for Alan Turing, no public thanks, no recognition. Everything about Bletchley remained classified for decades. He simply returned to academia, to quiet rooms filled with papers, symbols, and ideas about artificial intelligence that most people couldn't even comprehend yet. He was moving towards something new, machines that could simulate learning, reason, maybe even consciousness. But in the eyes of society, he was just another eccentric mathematician. All right, before we dive deeper into Turing's post-war journey, the triumphs, the heartbreak, and the legacy he never lived to see, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. If you're enjoying the story so far, leave a like to help others find this forgotten chapter of history, and share it with a friend who loves tales of courage and intellect as much as you do. Now, let's keep going. When the war ended in 1945, the world celebrated peace. But for Turing, peace came with silence. The secrets of Bletchley were buried, and he couldn't tell anyone about his part in it. He moved on to the National Physical Laboratory and proposed a radical idea: the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. It was, in essence, one of the first blueprints for a general-purpose computer. But bureaucracy strangled his vision. The project dragged, slowed by committees who couldn't grasp what they were sitting on. Imagine the frustration. The man who'd built machines that helped win the war was now ignored by the very institutions he'd saved. At the same time, Turing began exploring the idea of artificial intelligence. He asked questions no one else dared to. Could machines think? Could they make decisions? Could they dream? His 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, proposed what we now call the Turing test, a way to measure if a machine could convincingly mimic human conversation. In a sense, he was predicting the world we live in now, where machines can talk, reason, and even write stories about him. But life wasn't kind to him. In 1952, the British government discovered his homosexuality after a break-in at his home led to a police investigation. He was charged with gross indecency, the same cruel law that had destroyed Oscar Wilde decades before. Offered a choice between prison or chemical castration, Turing chose the latter, perhaps believing he could still continue his work. The treatment wrecked his body, drained his energy, and dulled his once vivid mind. His security clearance was revoked, cutting him off from the world of cryptography he'd helped define. He continued to work quietly, still driven by curiosity, experimenting with early computers and biological mathematics. But the isolation grew. The secrecy that had protected his wartime work now became a wall around him. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. Next to him lay an apple, partially eaten, laced with cyanide. He was 41 years old. His death was ruled a suicide, though even today some speculate about the details. What's certain is that a man who helped save millions died alone, punished by the very society he had saved. For decades, his name was almost forgotten. Only a handful of his colleagues remembered, whispering stories about the strange, brilliant man who'd once walked the halls of Bletchley with a mind that saw patterns no one else could. But history has a way of correcting itself slowly, painfully, but surely. In 2009, after public pressure, the British government issued a formal apology for his treatment. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a royal pardon. Today, his face is on the £50 note. His name is spoken with reverence in every corner of science and computing. He's no longer the hidden hero of a classified war. He's the father of modern computing, the man who proved that thought itself could be mechanized. And still, I can't help but imagine him at Bletchley, in that smoky hut, surrounded by noise, equations, and machines, lost in thought. Maybe he didn't care for recognition. Maybe all he wanted was to understand the puzzle of the universe, one pattern at a time. That's the legacy of Alan Turing, not just the code breaker, not just the genius, but the man who looked at the impossible and thought, "Give me time, and I'll find the key." I've often thought about how strange it is that one man, sitting in a dimly lit hut surrounded by clattering machines, could reshape the destiny of both war and peace. When Alan Turing cracked Enigma, he wasn't just unlocking German codes. He was unlocking the future itself. The same principles that guided his bombs, the idea that logic and patterns could be mechanized, became the seeds of everything we now take for granted. Every smartphone, every search engine, every satellite signal, even the very algorithm that allows you to watch this video. They all trace back to Turing's vision. It's breathtaking when you stop to think about it. But the beauty of Turing's legacy isn't just in the machines. It's in the philosophy behind them. He forced humanity to ask, what does it mean to think? When he proposed the idea of a universal machine, he wasn't imagining a cold, mechanical calculator. He was imagining something almost poetic, a device capable of mimicking the act of reasoning, of learning, of understanding. He wrote about imitation, about consciousness, about the boundaries between human and machine thought. It's hard not to feel that, in some quiet way, he was speaking to the future to us. The Turing test. His idea that if a machine could converse indistinguishably from a human, it might be said to think, became one of the most profound philosophical challenges of the 20th century. But what's fascinating is how modestly he framed it. He never claimed that machines would think like humans, only that we should be open to the possibility that intelligence might take many forms. Today, as artificial intelligence shapes our lives, as algorithms learn, adapt, and even create, we're still living inside Turing's thought experiment. Every time you ask a machine a question, and it answers every time code anticipates your needs, you're echoing his dream. Still, I don't think Turing saw machines as replacements for humanity. Quite the opposite. He believed that machines could amplify our creativity, help us explore what our own minds couldn't grasp alone. There's something deeply humane in that idea. For a man who was often seen as detached, even odd, his work was rooted in empathy, the belief that logic and compassion weren't opposites, but partners. After his death, the world moved on quickly, as it always does. The Cold War began, and code-breaking evolved into an industry of its own. But the people who'd worked with Turing never forgot him. They told quiet stories about his quirks, his stammering laugh, the way he'd run from Bletchley Park to his lodgings just to clear his head, or how he chained his teacup to the radiator so no one would steal it. They remembered how, despite the pressure, he'd comfort colleagues, offer gentle advice, or mutter encouraging words when things seemed hopeless. Beneath the numbers and logic, there was warmth, a genuine kindness that only those close to him ever saw. In the decades that followed, his influence began to surface in unexpected places. The first electronic computers built in the late 1940s and early 1950s. From Manchester's Baby to America's ENIAC, all bore traces of his conceptual groundwork. His 1936 paper on computable numbers, which most people couldn't even understand at the time, became the foundation for programming languages, data storage, and software design. He'd written that any process governed by rules could be replicated by a machine. That's the essence of computation. Whether you're designing an app or launching a space probe, you're working in a world that Alan Turing imagined before anyone else did. It's funny to think that while he was building his bombs, the term computer referred to people, mostly women, who performed mathematical calculations by hand. Turing saw what others couldn't, that machines could take on this role, not just faster, but with endless adaptability. He saw that computing wasn't about arithmetic. It was about thinking in patterns. That shift from math to meaning is what truly birthed the digital age. I remember visiting Bletchley Park once, years ago. The huts are still there, preserved as a museum now. You can still hear the faint echoes of typing, the hum of machines if you close your eyes, and standing in front of one of the restored bombs. There's a moment when you realize how alive the place still feels. Every lever, every wire, every click, it's like listening to the heartbeat of history. You can almost sense Turing's presence, quiet, observant, somewhere in the corner, still thinking. And yet, what breaks your heart is knowing that for decades after his death, his name wasn't even mentioned in history books. The official Secrets Act sealed the story. The world celebrated generals and politicians, but not the quiet mathematician who made their victories possible. His mother went to her grave never knowing what her son had done for the world. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the first classified papers were released, that historians began to understand the magnitude of his contribution. And when they did, it changed everything we thought we knew about World War II. The intelligence gathered from breaking Enigma, known as Ultra, was so crucial that Winston Churchill once called it my secret weapon. He even ordered that its existence remain hidden after the war, fearing that revealing it might expose future operations. Turing's brilliance had won a war in silence, and so, fittingly, his legacy began in silence too. But once the truth emerged, his legend grew. By the time the world was ready to celebrate him, it was too late for Alan himself, but perhaps that's fitting for a man who cared more about solving puzzles than being praised for them. His story began to inspire a new generation of thinkers, programmers, and dreamers. In the 1980s and 1990s, as computers began entering every home, Turing became a simpler reminder that the power of intellect and perseverance can change the world, even from the shadows. Then came something beautiful. The LGBTQ community began to reclaim Turing as one of their own, a hero not just of science, but of human resilience. He became a symbol of brilliance silenced by prejudice, and of truth outlasting injustice. His face appeared on murals, statues, and films. The 2014 movie The Imitation Game brought his story to millions, finally giving voice to the man behind the machine. For younger generations, it was the first time they heard his name. But for those who had studied him for years, it was a kind of vindication. The world was finally listening. Still, beyond the fame and films, I think what endures most about Turing is his way of seeing the world. He didn't view complexity as chaos. He believed that beneath the noise, there was always structure waiting to be found. Whether in ciphers, in nature, or in human behavior, he trusted that patterns held meaning if only we had the patience to uncover them. It's a beautiful idea to believe that understanding isn't about knowing everything, but about listening closely enough to what the world is already trying to tell us. In recent years, his influence has deepened in unexpected ways. Modern AI researchers still cite Turing's work as foundational. His concept of machines that could learn from experience is, in essence, what we now call machine learning. Neural networks, algorithms that evolve through feedback, all echo his early theories. Even the idea of artificial consciousness, the dream that a machine might one day truly feel, can be traced back to the questions he posed. He never gave definitive answers. He didn't need to. Asking the right questions was enough to set humanity on the path forward. And yet, For all his logic, there was something poetic about Turing's thinking. In one of his lesser-known writings, he compared a computer program to a seed, saying that intelligence could grow the same way a flower grows from simple beginnings to infinite complexity. It's not hard to see why he was fascinated by biology later in life, studying how patterns form in nature, why a leopard has spots, why flowers spiral the way they do. He saw code not just in machines, but in life itself. That's what makes him timeless. Alan Turing wasn't just a scientist. He was a bridge between logic and life, between war and peace, between machine and mind. He saw beauty in order, courage in curiosity, and strength in silence. He believed that even in our darkest hours, there's always something left to understand. Something left to build dots, so the next time you open your computer, ask a question to an AI, or even just watch a video online, remember the man who made it possible, the quiet genius who turned thought into machinery and changed the fate of nations. He may have been condemned by his own time, but he gifted the future everything it needed to imagine, to create, to think. Alan Turing didn't just break a code. He broke the boundary between human and machine, between idea and reality. And in doing so, he left us a message hidden not in cipher, but in legacy, that intelligence, compassion, and courage can coexist, and that even one voice, misunderstood and alone, can echo through centuries. Thank you for staying with this story. If it moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of human ingenuity. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next untold chapter of history. And leave a comment telling us what part of Turing's journey struck you most. Because in remembering him, we remember the very best of what humanity can be.